This video contains major spoilers for Deltarune and Undertale. I recommend against watching this video if you aren't familiar with these games. Let's begin with a simple question. What is the Dark World? Well, let's begin by going over everything we know about the Dark World so far. 1. The Dark World is created when a lightner inserts their will/determination into a sharp object and stabs the ground. A dark fountain forms, filling up the room with a substance known as darkness and transforming the room into a dark world. According to Rousey, the form of the Dark World and its inhabitants is determined by the will of the fountain. 2. Darkness that don't reflect the will of the fountain turn to stone. After Lancer frees Chris and Susie, he turns to stone, and so does Rule's card during a fight with Chris and Rousey. However, something interesting about Rules is that he turns to stone earlier when you take the Snowgrave route. Why? Because his existence wouldn't fit the darker narrative of the route, but this also means that Darkners not belonging to the Dark World has something to do with fitting the narrative of the Dark World. This immediately opens the floodgates as to whether or not these Darkners are actually real, or how much free will they have for that matter, but let's avoid talking about that for now. We don't want to derail ourselves, do we? 3. Magic only exists in the Dark World. We know that Catty and Chris studied the occult together, and the dialogue given to us by Pop-Up suggests that the two tried to summon some kind of demon, but nothing ever came of it. Though a seemingly random detail, it shows that magic does not work in a light world, and only in a dark world. Why? Well, I think it might have something to do with the darkness itself that fills the room, but that's as good of a guess as any. 4. Darkners are inspired by objects in the real world. This observation relies on my first theory, the darker-than-dark theory. In summary, Darkners aren't actually physical objects brought to life as so many believe, but rather are beings created by the dark fountains made of darkness that are grounded to reality in a sense by the objects seen in a room the Dark World resides in. I suppose a good analogy of this would be a painting, where the objects in the room serve the same purpose as the physical object the painting is being based off of. This works especially well in Chapter 2 because we have Darkners based off mere concepts, hackers, internet, pop-ups, etc., which are likely grounded to the computer lab computers. 5. Some Darkners consist of more than one object in the light world. This one is obvious enough. You have Mousewheel, which is made by grouping together several computer mice together. You also have Spamton, which is a little different, two objects put together to give context to a completely new Darkner. Spam email on a computer, and printed junk email in a trash bin. This ends up creating Spamton, an email spammer that lives inside of a trash bin. 6. The Dark Fountains are intelligent. The Dark Fountains, when creating the Dark World, understand what language is and how computers work, so much so that they draw the connection between computer viruses and the viruses seen in nature, as well as computer mice and a real-life animal their name is taken from. Alright, I have a thought exercise for you all. Let's say that you are Chris. You show up to school the day before Chapter 1 began. Suppose you went into the unused classroom and took the King of Spades card from the floor and hid it somewhere in a computer lab. What happens when the cyberworld gets created? What would Spade King become? Does King become a Darkner, but then immediately turn to stone because he doesn't fit the theme of the Dark World? If not, then a contradiction has been created, because this reveals that either 1. King didn't exist prior to his creation, or 2. The lore of the cyberworld didn't exist prior to its creation. King is a medieval king. He isn't related to anything digital at all, so either the cyberworld has changed to accommodate his existence, or the king has to change to accommodate the cyberworld, otherwise he turns into a statue. Unless this isn't about theme, but instead narrative. Think about it. Why do Rules and Lancer turn to stone at the same time that they do? The answer is because they aren't needed in a story anymore. Lancer being an extra party member at the current time would bog things down, and since Rules refuses to admit defeat, there needs to be some way to end the fight. And let's admit, Rules' card turning to stone at the time he did was hilarious. However, if that's true, then the Darkner didn't truly exist prior to the Fountain exposure. Why? Because it implies that Darkners must fit a narrative or will of the Fountain. They need a place to fit in, which only makes sense if they were created to fit into the Dark World. Having everything in room the Dark World was created in already have an identity prior makes the idea of Dark Worlds having consistent themes and narratives incredibly coincidental. If your story hinges on a bunch of extreme coincidences, it isn't considered good writing, is it? And with that in mind, there's only one way in which any of this can be resolved. That the Darkness were created at the same time the Dark Fountain was created. It's the one thing the game agrees on. You know how Queen goes crazy after the fountain was made? As though she finally has a chance to be the diabolical ruler she truly is? You know how Spamton immediately tries to steal the Neo-Body after the fountain was made? Yeah, these two things only make sense if the Dark World was just created. There's a problem with that. The Dark Worlds already have a history. Well, there's a simple answer to that. The history didn't actually happen. The Dark Fountains create a history, and then give Darkners false memories of that history. This concept actually has a name. It's called Last Thursdayism. It is the idea that the universe was created last Thursday, but with the appearance of being billions of years old. Under this idea, books, fossils, light on away from distant stars, and literally everything, including your memories from before last Thursday, were all created during the creation of the universe. This idea is mainly used as an absurdist mockery of the young Earth creationists that believe the universe is only 6,000 years old. Under this hypothesis, events like Spamton's rise and fall didn't actually happen, but everyone remembers it. And as for how Jevil was able to foreshadow Queen, and how Spamton knows about Mike despite them existing in the next Dark World that is yet to be made, well, there's only one explanation that can work. When a Dark Fountain creates its history, the Fountain intentionally leaves story threads open and unresolved so that a future Dark World can continue from them, to make the Dark Worlds feel more connected, which they already seem to be considering that Rousey can travel from the Castle Town to the Cyberworld with relative ease. With all this new information we've gained, I suspect we may have to reevaluate how the Dark Worlds are made, so let's look at everything the theory community currently believes so that we can throw it in the garbage. The most common consensus is that the creation of a Dark Fountain involves someone sufficiently determined stabbing the ground with the intent of creating a Dark Fountain. If the intent is not required, literally anyone stabbing the ground could cause the creation of a Dark Fountain, which is stupid. Anyway, a geyser of darkness spews out from the hole, filling the room with darkness. We don't know the actual nature of the darkness is. However, anything that steps inside it seems to transform, meaning that the physical structure of the rooms the Dark Worlds are contained in likely hasn't been changed. What took place in the closet is merely an exception and not a rule. The shape and form of the Dark World is commonly accepted to be derived from the objects in the room, and nothing else. However, the earlier analysis disproves this. The Dark Fountain, the very thing that gives the Dark World form, understands the English language well enough to draw a connection between computer viruses and biological viruses. The only way for this to even be possible is for the Fountain's understanding of the English language to come from somewhere else. Like the person creating the Fountain? Wait, let's have a look at what Rousey says just as Lancer turns to stone. And now let's compare that to what Queen says about the night. Come to think of it, it seems like these two sets of dialogue are meant to be linked. There's the will that the knight puts into their blade before making the fountain, and then there's the will of the fountain. One probably comes from the other, right? Meaning that the Dark Worlds are like reflections of the person that made them. This is creating a really interesting setup for Chapter 3, isn't it? In fact, this theory has basically been confirmed with what we've given for Chapter 3 so far, since the Green Room looks like it's been ripped straight from the cyber world, and there's a mouse hanging somewhere. Why? Simple, because Chris, when making the Dark Fountain, thought of their adventure in the cyber world and how fun it was. Therefore, it would be meant to reflect part of the cyber world, wouldn't it? But this raises a question. What actually is determination, then? Well, I'll drop my empirical facade for some good old-fashioned speculation, and just drop the ball right here. Dreams. Creativity, imagination, and dreams seem to be an important force, especially in Chapter 2. They directly factor into the Neo body being as powerful as it is. The fact that it's such a powerful dream is the reason why the body is so powerful to begin with, and I think it will continue to be a pattern that the secret bosses are tied to dreams or creativity, whether the character themselves embody these things, or if an artifact they wield or utilize embodies them instead. What I'm suggesting is that the Dark Worlds are basically dream worlds that twist and bend to the will of their inhabitants. If you have a particularly strong imagination or connection to imagination, you may be able to bend it better than others. Look at Noelle, where her fears about electrical wire and power sockets becomes a reality in the cyber world, and the fact that Queen is Noelle's projection of her mother plays a massive part in this as well. Maybe Noelle's potential comes from how she's so repressed that once she finally becomes in tune with herself, she becomes unstoppable. Perhaps that is the true reason for why Queen wants to make Noelle the next knight. This could explain why she's the key to the weird route, too. She's able to bend the world so much that it allows us to sort of use her to break out of the Dark World's intended experience. And this makes things very, very interesting, doesn't it? Let's ask a basic question here. What the heck is balance? Specifically, I'm referring to the supposed balance between light and dark. What does it actually mean? I have a feeling that most of you would reply with something along the lines of the amount of dark fountains open. However, this would imply that 2 whole dark fountains open at the same time would result in a balance being shifted heavily. But it isn't. Rousey states that the opposite is true, that the balance has only begun to shift. This shouldn't make sense under our current hypothesis, right? And while we're at it, how the heck is Rousey able to travel from the castle town to Cyberworld? Let's just cut to the chase. Where do these dark fountains actually come from? I imagine that many of you would be quick to say that all the darkness the fountains are spewing out comes from beneath the ground. However, this doesn't make much sense. If a simple stab is enough to spew out all the darkness, then a simple drilling project and construction project would let loose enough darkness to cause the roaring. It just doesn't make sense. So where is it? Supposedly it would just be in an area where it's just darkness. And if one was to visit it, it would look like a vast sea of darkness, considering that all the dark worlds we've been to all reflect the objects in the room they were made in. Without any objects, it would just be darkness. Now, I'd like to ask you all a question. Has there been any point in the game where such a place has been suggested to exist? Of course. Of course there is. We've been there before. And we will most certainly be there again. The following diagram shows the background image for the so-called Goner Maker sequence, specifically how it's made. Pretty interesting. Something I've found out is that the part of the original sprite shown is used to construct the sprite for the Dark Fountain. Have a look. This might not seem like much, that is, until you put the 2 base sprites on top of one another. Now look. A lot of people already think that the device Goner Maker sequence takes place entirely within a Dark Fountain, which sort of makes sense. However, I think I could step this up a notch. Why is that? Well, because I'd like to tell you what the sprite name is actually called. It's called image_depth. Again, this might not seem very consequential until you consider that that word is only used once in the entire game, right here. Jevil, a man whose insanity is highly suspected to be the direct result of Gaster's shenanigans, is now talking about some place called the Depths. Gaster, who speaks to the player in a strange dark realm whose background image looks like the inside of a dark fountain, literally named image_depth. He's saying that Hell's Roar bubbles from the depths. We know exactly what Hell's Roar is. It's the roaring, the event in which the barrier between light and dark shatters, causing fountains to rip out of the ground, piercing the sky and blanketing the world in darkness, all while titans march from the fountains and destroy everything in their way. Sometime later, the pressure of the darkness blanketing the earth becomes so great that all the darkness turns to stone. So what is the Depths? Well, you've probably figured it out by now.
It's the source of all darkness. It's a second layer of reality that runs parallel to the light world, perhaps an in-between of sorts, and since the pressure of the darkness is great enough to crush the darkness into statues, I imagine that the conditions of the depths would resemble the bottom of the ocean, just without the drowning part, a place of pure darkness that hasn't seen light since its formation. And speaking of the bottom of the ocean, I uncovered something recently that is interesting. In Greek mythology, after a long war, the Titans were imprisoned beneath the abyss. And what comes out from the fountains during Hell's roar? The Titans. And if Gaster was in the depths, it's likely that it's the very place he was referring to in Entry 17. In Undertale, the Gaster followers say that Gaster fell into his own creation, and while most people assume that they are referring to the core since it was mentioned earlier, what if it isn't? Remember that the core is just an electrical plant that harnesses geothermal energy from the ground and uses it to power the underground. There shouldn't be anything special about it to warrant being shattered across time and space, so then there's only one other conclusion that can be made. That when Gaster was shattered across time and space in Undertale, the creation he fell into was a dark fountain. One singular surface-level dark fountain most likely won't cause the roaring, but keep making them and you're punching holes into the barrier between light and dark where the Titans are, making it easier for them to break out, and heaven forbid you make a fountain within a dark world. No wonder Birdly nearly gave Rousey a heart attack. Keep diving deeper into the darkness, and something might come up to meet you. We always ask what happens if it could get darker than dark, but now we know. Gaster ventured too deep into the darkness, falling into the depths, and because of it he became shattered across time and space, because the depths defies time, and that could explain how Gaster is capable of contacting the secret bosses before the fountain was made, because again, the depths defies time. However, Gaster is not the only one trapped inside the depths. In fact, someone from the light world is trapped as well. Someone who many of you are no doubt familiar with. I'd like to introduce you to a Deltarune character you've potentially never heard of before, and while they haven't been mentioned many times directly in Deltarune, their disappearance has haunted Hometown for years. This character's name is December Holiday. She's Noelle's older sister, and she was always the one to look out for her and protect her from danger. However, something horrible happened a long time ago, a memory that both Chris and Noelle have repressed for a long time, as evidenced by this page on the Spamton sweepstakes. Dessa's disappearance caused a lot of grief and anger between the Holiday and Dreamer families, and they only begun to reconcile when Noelle and Chris met in the cyber world again, as shown by the character tease. Chris and Noelle used to be very close friends when they were younger. They spent a lot of time together, but something happened to Dess that involved the Dreamers, and especially Chris. This memory, that last memory of Dess, Noelle claims that they didn't find anything interesting back there, but that's not true. Clearly whatever happened was very stressful. She's repressing her memories, and it's likely that Chris is doing the same, but when it comes to trauma, physical reminders of a repressed memory would bring it back and make things infinitely worse, and nowhere is that more apparent than when Chris and Susie visit the bunker, in the forest behind the graveyard. Chris likely blames themselves for what happens, and thinks that they are at fault for Dessa's disappearance. That bunker, the one that's labeled Shelter in the game files, it's obviously connected in some way to Gaster, considering it plays the same music that plays in the background of Entry 17. We know that that entry is canonical to Deltarune because it's repeated on a website back in 2016 in Wingdings. Now, back to that bunker. It would be really interesting if that bunker had a dark fountain inside it. Given that monsters cannot seal a dark fountain, when Death stumbled into that dark fountain, she must have gone deeper and deeper down, hoping to find a way out, until she found herself inside the Depths itself. And we hear echoes of her calls for help if we dive deep enough into the game files, deep enough into the code, deep enough into the depths. Death has been trapped in the depths for God knows how long, but it's our mission to find her at some point. The Closet Dark World is by far the strangest Dark World we've come across so far. It's like an anomaly. The last two Dark Worlds we've visited all share similar patterns, but the Closet Dark World doesn't follow any of that. This is our starting point, the cliffs, the section of the Dark World where we find ourselves after falling asleep. The walls here don't look like any school closet I've ever seen. They look more like a moldy old cellar. Based on how we've analyzed the previous Dark Worlds, I doubt this Dark World was created by the night, and putting aside the very intricate details about the color, this area is just bizarre, dry, with cracks and mold everywhere. There's strange eye shapes carved into the walls that look like the eyes of the Titans described by Ralsei, and occasionally there's black liquid crawling out from these cracks. Just like in a cyber world, there are steep jumps and slides, as well as puzzles with cryptic text like, in this land, only eyes blinded by the darkness can see the light. This takes on a completely new meaning when we consider the ramifications of the existence of the depths, almost foreshadowing the idea that we will visit it in the future, perhaps when the roaring happens. The other part of the Closet Dark World is the Castle Town. The Castle Town's fine, nothing too out of the ordinary about it. Of course, Ralsei knows about the characters' personal lives to be able to base Chris's new room on a room that actually exists in the real world, going as far as to making the trophies on Asriel's side of the room magically belong to Chris, which is so goddamn bizarre because it implies that Ralsei knows about Chris's envy towards Asriel. This entire thing warrants discussion, because right off the bat, Ralsei knows things that he just shouldn't know, such as the names of Chris and Susie before they've even introduced themselves. How is that possible, anyway? It's understandable that Darkners can immediately recognize Lightners, and as suggested by Spamton, the thing that distinguishes them could be the soul that Chris has, but clearly not their names. It just doesn't work out, and this isn't a fluke either. Look at the prophecy itself for a moment. Just look at it. These three heroes are blatantly Chris and Susie, and also Ralsei. There's no conceivable way that he could know about the identities of the two Darkners that are going to randomly enter a closet on a Thursday morning before it actually happens. It's just not possible. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Ralsei knows about saving, a concept that isn't even noticeable to anyone in Deltarune unlike Undertale, or even a player for that matter. How? How does Ralsei even know about a player? Discarding the possibility that Ralsei is an all-seeing eye of the game, there's really only one way that Ralsei could have the knowledge that he possesses, because there's literally only one character in all of Deltarune that shares it. Gaster. Let's knock away the obvious one first. In the Gunner Maker sequence, we directly give our name to Gaster, meaning that the only person who even has the capability of knowing our name is Gaster. So, Ralsei knowing the name of the player is straightforward. It was revealed to him by Gaster. It goes without saying that Ralsei isn't the only Darkman that has been contacted by Gaster in the past. Jevil and Spamton have been as well, and the forbidden knowledge that he gave to Spamton and Jevil drove them insane. So, what is it that Gaster revealed to them about the world? Well, I believe I know the answer, and it has to do with what these Darkners did with their knowledge. To begin, what did Jevil do? Right, he went insane. He began to view the world as nothing more than a game where he never faced consequences for your actions, a game where he could do anything, a game where he could fight everyone, and Spamton, he became desperate. After the phone call stopped coming, he lost his magic and his corporate empire crumbled. Over time he became insane, speaking like a madman, and then, upon finding Chris, the very first thing that he tries to do is try to steal their soul. An odd callback to Undertale. But why does he do that anyway? Well, it's simple. Ralsei lays it out for us at the very beginning of the game. Our soul holds the fate of the world inside it. In other words, using that soul could lead someone to believe that their choices matter in a world where you can't choose who you are. That only means that the straw that broke the camel's back for these Darkners is the revelation about choice. That their choices don't matter because fate is controlled in the Dark World by the will of the Fountain, which comes from the night, mirroring this. the second voice. The voice that discards the vessel and tells you that no one can choose who they are in this world. That voice belongs to the knight. We knew that from the last video. The knight is the second voice. And in this world, in their world, your choices don't matter. They never have and they never will, and that's why Snowgrave exists. Because abusing Noel's power allows us to completely derail the narrative of the game, completely subvert the knight, and have Spamton temporarily become a big shot despite fate itself denying it. Maybe that's why the player would even choose to go through this route in the first place. What's interesting is that every secret boss's reaction to this knowledge is a representation of a stage of grief. Jevil embraces the revelation with open arms, realizing that he can do anything if your choices don't mean anything.
I can do anything.
While Spamton viciously fights back against the will of the fountain, Jevil represents acceptance, while Spamton represents bargaining. So what does Rousey represent? Denial. Rousey actively believes that your choices matter. In fact, he desperately tries to make it so our choices matter more than anyone else's choices out of sheer spite, which shows that he does know the truth, but he doesn't want to believe it just because of how awful the truth it is. Denial is the first stage of grief, and acceptance is the last. It's important to realize that trauma can last for an extremely long time, and in some cases, never be resolved. One of Chapter 2's focuses is Rousey trying to figure out his own identity, which is very interesting because the castle itself is barren and empty by the start of Chapter 1, and when the darkness from the Card Kingdom are brought to the closet, the castle town completely transforms. New buildings completely replace the old ones, and if we go with the idea that Rousey is an extension of the castle town, or vice versa, or something like that, this is very interesting because it means that whatever identity Rousey had before the start of Chapter 1 is something that he actively hates and wants to replace with something new. The castle town is barren, the shop's empty. In short, Rousey doesn't think he's good enough, and that definitely means he has depression. How many characters is that? 3? Chris, Spamton, Rousey? Oh, you can't forget Noel. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Anyway, we now know the source of Rousey's knowledge, Gaster. Gaster contacted Rousey in some way, providing him with the forbidden knowledge, including a prophecy which is spelled out to him on the Deltarune website back in 2016. Let's take a step back and look at the fountain itself that gives Castletown its form. It seems to be the only Dark World whose fountain seems to be below the room that the fountain appears to be inside, and the room eventually caves in, collapsing and sending Chris and Susie into the cliffs, and in Eclipse you start to hear the song Ocean.ogg before waking up and hearing some ominous music. This isn't how dark fountains work. I mean, we've already gone over this in the beginning. The room doesn't collapse or anything, it just fills up with darkness. Wait. What if the Dark World is actually beneath the closet? What if it's deeper than the other Dark Worlds? What if the closet Dark World is literally inside the depths? That's right, the Dark World in this case operates in reverse, surrounded by something akin to the barrier between light and dark. If you want a real-life comparison, think of a submarine. That's what makes the Dark Fountain pure. It doesn't have any exposure to the light world and thus can operate on its own. This would make the Great Door something that could connect to any Dark World. If the castle town is in the depths, it could easily move around, or connect to a certain point of the light world, allowing the castle town's entrance or exit to be virtually anywhere, including another Dark World, explaining how Rousey was able to travel to the cyber world. With the closet Dark World being inside of the depths, what do you think happens when the roaring actually happens? Dark fountains rip through the ground, the barrier between light and dark shatters, and the depths overtakes the light world, covering the entire world in darkness. But what's left? What's left is the castle town, a sanctuary for lightners and darkners to live in after the roaring happens. That is why it's called a shelter, because it's the castle town Dark World that was in the bunker before. It makes sense why it's called a shelter now, because that's exactly where the Lightners are going to go once the roaring happens, to hide while the heroes try to fight off the Titans and banish the angels to heaven. It all makes sense. And with that, everything has been solved. This is a video that I've wanted to make for a long time. More than a year, actually. This is a theory that's been in my head for a really long time, and now I finally have the chance to share it, so I would really appreciate it if you could give your thoughts on it, because this is genuinely one of the most insane theories ever. With that, I appreciate you watching. Thanks, and, well, I'll see you next time.